Welcome, Kecia.
Thank you.
So, this is her book, Marriage and Slavery in Early Islam, and it's actually it's an academic book, but it's a very exciting and groundbreaking book because we hear all the time about marriage questions, gender questions in Islam. Very few people have gone and explored the intellectual history, the foundations of the development of Islamic law on marriage and gender. And I was just wondering, Kecia, what inspired you to write this book?
I had to write a dissertation. That's part of it. Certainly, those who are graduate students in the audience know that it's important to pick a project that is both exciting enough to keep you at it for the years that it will take, and not so humongous as to swallow you whole. I managed the first and not so much the second. From prospectus to publication took me 10 years. So this is the fruit of a long process. I actually started out very much interested in contemporary questions about feminist interpretation of Quran, legal reform in Muslim-majority societies. I was reading a lot of history at the time. I was also in the mid-1990s reading the really exciting work on women and gender in Muslim history that had started to emerge. Leila Ahmed's Women and Gender in Islam, Denise Spellberg's book on Aisha, Nikki Keddie and Beth Barron's edited anthology, Women in the Middle East. And interestingly, all of these things were converging on a portrait of the present that seemed to be really disconnected from the past. What people were producing in the late 20th century, trying to talk about how Muslims should treat questions of women and gender, was very Victorian in its orientation. It didn't seem to me to be reasonably connected to the kinds of early Muslim history that I was beginning to read about in some of these other sources. And what was interesting also about this new body of scholarship on women and Islam was that none of it was really talking about law, even though law, and especially family law, was occupying the center of a lot of the contemporary literature about Muslim women. Women's status in Islam, gender equity in Islam. A lot of it was about the family and a lot of it was about marriage, and a lot of it drew on law, and yet there was seeming to be a real mismatch. And then I started reading the legal sources themselves, and then I was hooked, and there was no turning back, and I ended up writing about the 9th century.
Wow.
So, in your
Really exciting.
Better now.
Hello?
Okay, I'll just speak loudly. In your research, you came across a lot of information in terms of how marriage was seen possibly in other religions as well. Because we get a lot from the Jewish traditions and also the Christian traditions. Could you reflect a little bit about, in general, how marriage was seen as a whole in generally patriarchal societies?
I think that's one of the most important things that I realized over the course of my research, is that if you're trying to understand marriage in Islam's formative centuries, the appropriate place to look for parallels is not 20th century Morocco, right? Or for that matter, the 16th century Ottoman Empire. It's late antiquity, right? What are the Romans doing? What are the Jews doing? What is early Christianity like? Christianity is a little bit of an outlier because of a strong pro-celibacy trend in a lot of the interpretive literature. But in terms of what Muslims are doing in the 8th century, the 9th century, or for that matter back in the 7th century, the parallels to other kinds of ancient Near Eastern legal systems are very strongly apparent. And the places where Muslims differ are also really telling, because even though there are any number of things that these traditions have in common, which is to say a strong role for the father in arranging marriages of children, or certain kinds of male dominance within the marriage unit, right? So the husband has certain rights that the wife doesn't have. Sexual double standards, sexual use of slaves. In all of these respects, Islam draws from a pool of available options, but then makes particular kinds of choices, guided by the Quran, guided by the Sunnah, guided by the cultural milieu of the various early jurists, but also, and particularly as the centuries go on and move towards the period I talk about in the book, which is mostly the 9th century, in order to have a coherent system. So certain things that were options in other traditions don't show up in the Muslim tradition, and other things that other traditions dealt with differently, like the legal personhood of slaves, because there is a strong recognition of the potential religious personhood of slaves and a concomitant notion of their legal personhood. They can marry, which they couldn't do in these other traditions, certainly not in Roman law. Then you're faced with new kinds of problems that, say, the Romans didn't confront, which is you're a slave owner, you have a male slave, he wants to get married. Well, okay, but what does that mean for your control as a slave owner over his labor, over his mobility? If it's a female slave, even more so, right? How do a husband and master control what's going on with her? And one of the things that I realized fairly early on in the project, after perhaps 6 months a year of working full-time on the project, was that slavery was not just a sort of marginal distraction from what else was going on. It wasn't just that there were some Muslims who happened to be slaves and so the Muslim jurists had to think about it. The reality is that by thinking about slaves as legal subjects as well as chattels, and thinking about slavery as one kind of important interpersonal relationship that could be used to model others, all of Muslim jurisprudence about marriage and family and household was affected.
Very interesting. And then also speaking of the 8th and 9th centuries, can you tell a little bit about that time? And because your book conveys something of the drama of this, that there's a very much of a human element, there's a social element, the personalities involved, and also something about the time because people have sort of this stereotype of Middle Ages, then you jump ahead to like the Beatles, 1960s or something. And can you tell us something about how, like, say, the 8th, 9th century, the Silk Road era, is different from, say, Victorian period?
I could say a lot about that. Let me start by telling you what the original image for the cover of this book was going to look like. I was telling someone about this just before we started. It was sand dunes, and then some footprints, right? And then the title and the sort of pink cast to the whole thing. And my eldest daughter looked at it and she said, "It looks like Harry Potter walked by with his invisibility cloak on." This was sort of not what we were going for. And I emailed my editor and I said, these guys were in cities, right? They weren't out in the desert somewhere. This is not a kind of primitive Bedouin thing going on, right? They're in Cairo, they're in Baghdad, they're in Kufa. There are circles of jurists who are meeting and arguing with one another. They're in conversation, certainly with the rulers. The middle of the 8th century is the transition from the Umayyad dynasty to the Abbasids. But most of the people that I'm studying, and I'm looking at works attributed to students of Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik and Imam Shafi'i. Actually, the books are attributed to Imam Shafi'i, but his students put them together. This is before you get the big flowering of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, and then the huge upsurge in philosophy and theology, and the Inquisition about particular theological positions. So this is still sort of a fluid time. But one thing that really happens in the 8th and the 9th century that was not the case in the 7th and early part of the 8th century is that you start to get systematization of legal thought. So it's not people giving positions on topics. It's people really beginning to argue with one another. And by arguing, they refine their doctrines. Because say we debate and you ask me something for which I don't have a very satisfactory answer and I sort of splutter and it doesn't go very well. Well, I'm going to go back to my teaching circle and I'm going to ask about that. And the next time we meet, or the next time I meet someone else from your circle, I'm going to have a better answer. But part of what that means is not just coming up with new reasoning, it may also mean subtly altering a particular kind of trajectory of argument. So one of the really salient conclusions, I think, of this book, and one of the things that I didn't start out really thinking about, but ended up thinking about, is the extent to which this is almost a sort of closed universe. These are scholars arguing with one another. And the products of their conversations, on the one hand, are meant to have broader relevance, although it's not like a legal code that the judges will then go and directly apply. But a lot of what they're arguing about is not so much because they think these are the precise and only possible religious rules, but because they want logically defensible positions. They want to be unassailable, which leads to them taking things to their logical conclusion because they know that people in a competing circle are going to be coming to question them about it. And then eventually these go on to develop in the 10th century into the legal schools that we know today, the Maliki, the Hanafi, the Shafi'i, the Hanbali, which develops as a similar kind of legal school a little bit later. And of course, the Jafaris are there, but it's a different trajectory, and they're mostly not arguing at this point with the other students of Jafar as-Sadiq.
Can I try this? Okay.
It doesn't like you.
Okay. It just says I can speak loudly enough. What kind of struck me, I said on an overall basis, whenever I hear discussions on marriage in Islam and legality of the gender roles, to me, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's marriage with Khadija radiallahu anha was such an equal partnership. In fact, she was actually his boss. And I don't know how they reconcile that reality with using terminology used for slavery.
Right. So, first of all, the marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Khadija radiallahu anha doesn't get much play in the legal sources because it shows up in the seerah literature, but there isn't a lot of precedent that ends up being directly relevant to the kinds of questions they're asking about, right? Because you don't have a lot of hadith that detail incidents in his life, and where you do have reports of particular marital incidents, you're usually getting them from the Medinan period of his career, or you're getting them, say, directly from some of his surviving wives, right? Who don't know anything about his marriage with Khadija because he didn't have other wives at that time, right? So it's a completely separate period. Where you do get information about the Prophet's marriages and about particular precedents that might be deemed legally exemplary, they do show up for the jurist. And in fact, the third chapter of the book talks about the division of time among wives, and so how one goes about thinking about companionship and how spouses should relate to one another. And the Prophet appears as a model of fairness and justice. And so his precedent is cited, but it's that precedent. Interestingly, it's not the precedent for polygamy because the jurors took it for granted that this was completely and totally permissible, and they weren't worried about that. We're worried about it, and so we have books about polygamy. They don't have chapters on polygamy. They assume that it's okay, and then they talk about within this structure how do you create fairness. So they're asking very different questions.